That night, I stood in the small farmhouse kitchen, my hands still trembling from holding the winning lottery ticket. $5 million. After years of serving overseas, after nights of sleeping in deserts with nothing but discipline to keep me steady, after sacrifices that left scars on both my skin and my mind, the universe had finally given me something unexpected. I had walked back into my childhood home with the ticket tucked deep inside my wallet, thinking foolishly that maybe this victory would bring a little light to a family that had always seen me as an outsider. I was wrong. My name is Captain Laura Mitchell. I am 28 years old. I served 6 years in the Army. I had learned to shoot straight march until my feet bled and keep calm under mortar fire. But nothing I had done prepared me for the enemy I found within my own blood. My brother Daniel sat in the living room that night, the glow of the television flickering across his face. He was 32 taller than me, stronger perhaps in build, but rotted from the inside out by years of gambling debts and bitterness. He looked at me not with pride, but with hunger. He had always seen me as competition. In his eyes, a woman could never be the soldier, the provider, the one in control. Yet here I was, with $5 million. My father Harold sat beside him, beer in hand, jaw clenched. My mother Donna fussed with a plate in the kitchen, but avoided my eyes. I had learned long ago that in this house, silence was complicity. I told them about the lottery win because I still wanted to believe family could mean something. Instead of congratulations, I saw calculation. Harold grunted that money like that belonged to the whole family. Daniel laughed that as the oldest son, he would make sure it was used wisely. Donna asked how soon the cash would arrive. I laughed softly, at first thinking they were teasing, but no one laughed with me. Hours later, I realized their words had not been a joke. Midnight came. I was still awake, reviewing in my notebook how to invest wisely, maybe a home near the base, maybe a small fund for veterans struggling like I had seen so many times. That was when Daniel entered my room without knocking. The smell of alcohol came before him. He set a half-empty glass of whiskey on my desk and told me to celebrate properly. My instincts told me not to drink, but his hand was heavy on my shoulder. Out of habit, I obeyed, sipping once to keep peace. The burn down my throat was sharp and sudden. The room began to tilt slightly. I knew this feeling. It was not just alcohol. I stood quickly, but his hand shoved me back into the chair, the glass toppled liquid spreading across my notebook, blurring my plans for the future. He smiled in a way I had seen card sharks smile when they were about to flip the winning hand. In that instant, I understood. He was not going to wait for inheritance. He was not going to negotiate. He wanted all of it, and he had a plan. He pulled a rope from behind his back. My breath caught. I had seen ropes in darker places used for purposes no soldier forgets. My pulse thundered in my ears. I tried to reach for my phone, but he was faster. His fist landed hard against my shoulder, sending pain radiating down my arm. My knees buckled as he forced me toward the ceiling beam. In the dim light of my childhood bedroom, I saw a chair already placed beneath the beam. He had planned this. He shoved me onto the chair, looped the rope around my wrists, then forced it around my throat. I gasped, the coarse fibers biting against my skin. This was not just robbery. This was a staged death. He muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear, that everyone would believe it. The soldier sister who could not handle civilian life, the one with trauma, the one with no husband or children. A tragic story that would leave him the sympathetic heir. He tugged the rope tighter and the world narrowed. I could hear my father's voice from the hall. He asked if it was done. My mother's softer voice replied that it was better this way, cleaner. My lungs screamed for air. My hands fought against the knots. Panic surged, but training rose with it. Breathe slow. Think. Adapt. Overcome. I shifted my weight just enough to loosen the pressure, just enough to find a pocket of air. Daniel yanked again, and fury burned through me. Fury that the man I had shared childhood dinners with now looked at me as nothing more than a ticket to pay off his gambling debts. Fury that my parents, who should have protected me, were whispering approval in the hallway. My chest ached. Spots flickered in my vision. For a moment, I truly thought it was the end. But a soldier does not surrender in the first strike. I forced myself to stillness to feigned weakness. I let my body go slack so he would think I had lost the fight. His laugh was the sound of victory, cruel and short. That laugh told me I still had a chance. He believed I was gone already. I heard him step away, muttering about bank accounts and keys. My mind locked onto one thing: survival first, then justice. The rope still pressed hard, but I shifted again, inch by inch. My pulse was loud, my vision hazy, but my will sharpened to a razor point. This was not the battlefield I had trained for, but it was the battlefield I had. That night in my parents' house, I understood the real war had only just begun. I grew up in that same farmhouse, its walls carrying memories I wished I could erase. From the outside, it looked harmless white paint chipped by years of rain, a porch swing that creaked when the wind blew across the fields. To a stranger, it might have looked like a safe American home. Inside, it was a battlefield of a different kind. My father Harold believed that authority was proven by fists and shouted words. When I was a child, he told me repeatedly that daughters were weak, that only sons carried the family forward. Daniel, 4 years older, wore that crown proudly. He was allowed to make mistakes, to gamble, to drop out of college, and each failure was excused because he was the son. I was told to sit straight, to be silent, to serve. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 12. Daniel knocked over a pitcher of milk, the liquid spreading across the table. My father's hand landed on me instead of him. I had not touched the pitcher, but I was the one punished. The sting on my cheek lasted only a moment, but the humiliation stayed for years. My mother, Donna, watched from her chair, eyes fixed on her plate. Her silence taught me that in this family, survival meant compliance. The message was clear: protect the son, sacrifice the daughter. That pattern continued through high school. Daniel borrowed my savings for textbooks, though he never bought them. He borrowed my car and returned it with dents and an empty tank. My protests were met with laughter, or worse, with Harold's fist pounding the table and his voice booming that a good daughter never disrespected her brother. By 17, I felt trapped in a house that did not want me except as a servant. When recruiters visited the school, I saw a door. The Army offered escape discipline purpose. I signed papers on my 18th birthday, and the moment I left for basic training, I breathed air that tasted like freedom for the first time. Military life was not easy. It broke me down and rebuilt me. I carried 70 pounds of gear across desert heat. I learned to fire weapons until my shoulder bruised. I learned to stay awake through exhaustion. But through it all, I found strength that my family had tried to convince me I did not have. I served with men and women who did not care if I was a daughter or a son, only that I could hold the line. I found brothers and sisters in uniform who would shield me with their lives. For 6 years, I gave everything to the flag, and when my deployment ended, I returned with scars that only other soldiers could fully understand. My parents greeted me with stiff smiles. Daniel offered a sarcastic salute and asked how many medals I had collected like trinkets. I swallowed my anger and told myself it did not matter because I had survived. Then fate dropped something unexpected into my lap. One random afternoon, standing in line at a gas station, I bought a lottery ticket on a whim. Days later, I stared at numbers that matched perfectly: $5 million. At first, I laughed out loud, not out of greed, but out of disbelief. For once in my life, luck was on my side. I imagined a small apartment of my own, a place where no one could slam doors in my face. I imagined donating part to veterans who slept on sidewalks back in the city, men I had served beside who deserved more. For the first time, I felt a future unchained from Harold's voice, unburdened by Daniel's shadow. Yet the irony cut deep. The moment I shared the news with my family, their faces did not light up. Harold's eyes narrowed as though calculating numbers on a ledger. Donna asked about timelines, about when checks would arrive. Daniel grinned, but it was not joy, it was possession. He slapped me on the back so hard my teeth clacked and declared that I had finally done something useful for the family. Useful, not victorious, not admirable, just useful, as if I had been a tool waiting to be wielded for their benefit. In that moment, I realized that money would not heal this family. It would expose the cracks that had always been there. My childhood had taught me to expect nothing from them, yet a small part of me still longed for approval, still hoped they would be proud. Instead, they circled like vultures. The house I had once seen as a prison now felt like a trap set with bait. The memories of bruises, of silent dinners, of whispered prayers to be invisible all came rushing back. My army years had given me courage, but walking into that house with 5 million in my pocket was like walking back into enemy territory without armor. I had spent my youth trying to prove I was worthy. Now I stood on the edge of realizing that in their eyes I would never be more than a resource to exploit. That is why the night Daniel carried that rope into my room did not truly surprise me. The form of the attack shocked me, but the betrayal itself was carved into the history of our family. The first signs came quickly, small details that anyone else might have ignored, but to me, they screamed danger. Daniel started hovering around me more than usual, pretending it was casual brotherly concern, but I could see the sharpness in his gaze every time my phone buzzed with a bank notification. He asked how I planned to manage $5 million, and when I told him I would consult a financial advisor, he laughed as if I had told a joke. He said men in the family always made the financial decisions, and it was time I respected that tradition. My father nodded in agreement, and my mother looked away, stirring sugar into her coffee, though she had not touched her cup in hours. I brushed it off as arrogance at first, but the pattern grew. Daniel demanded to see the lottery ticket itself, claiming he wanted to frame it for luck. I refused, and his smile faltered into something harder, something colder. A few days later, I found my desk drawer pulled open, papers, shuffled my notebook, shifted from where I had left it. Nothing was missing, but the invasion was clear. I began to lock everything I could, though I knew locks meant little in a house where Daniel had every spare key. At dinner one evening, Harold pounded his fork against the table and declared that the money would save the family farm. He said I owed them for raising me, that everything I had achieved was because they had kept me alive. Donna murmured that Daniel was the one who needed help, that his debts were serious, and I should step up as a daughter to protect my brother. I sat there in silence, my jaw tight, because I knew any protest would only escalate into shouting. But inside me, a storm brewed. I had survived mortar fire nights without sleep, days without food, yet the way they spoke about me as if I were nothing but a bank account made my chest ache in ways the battlefield never had. I began noticing Daniel spending more time online, hunched over his laptop at odd hours. When he left the browser open one morning, I caught glimpses of phrases in the search bar that made my blood run cold. Insurance policies, clauses about self-inflicted death, payouts for next of kin. He slammed the laptop shut when he saw me watching and barked at me to mind my own business. My father scolded me for snooping. My mother shook her head and whispered that I was imagining things. The gaslighting was sharp and practiced. I started to feel as if the walls of the house themselves were conspiring. A week later, my car would not start. The mechanic told me someone had tampered with the fuel line. I stared at the invoice with numb hands, realizing Daniel had borrowed my car the night before under the excuse of picking up groceries. He returned it empty, just like always, but this time it was more than negligence. It was sabotage. At night, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. I locked it, but locks had never stopped Daniel. He rattled the handle twice, then retreated. Each creak of the floorboards became a warning. I began sleeping with a small tactical flashlight in my hand, a soldier's habit, reminding myself that awareness was survival. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find Donna whispering urgently to Harold. They stopped when they saw me, but not before I caught the words she should not know. My father covered quickly, saying they were talking about bills, but his eyes betrayed him. They were planning something. I could feel it in the heaviness of the air, the way everyone hushed when I entered a room. The most chilling moment came when I sat at the family computer to check my email and discovered I could not log in. My password had been changed. I reset it using security questions only I should know, and when I regained access, I saw forwarded emails messages about my bank account attempts to reset passwords on my online banking. Someone in this house had been trying to take control. My suspicion narrowed to Daniel. He had always been reckless, but now recklessness mixed with desperation was a recipe for disaster. I confronted him in the living room. I asked if he had touched my accounts. He smiled too easily, leaned back on the couch, and asked if I was paranoid from too many years in the army. His words were laced with mockery. He called me unstable, said maybe I was not fit to handle the pressure of millions. My father chuckled in agreement. My mother wrung her hands and begged us not to fight, her voice trembling though she offered no defense for me. I walked away that evening with anger burning hot in my chest. I told myself I would be careful, that I would protect what was mine. But in the quiet of my room, I felt the weight of isolation pressing down harder than any pack I had carried in the desert. The signs grew louder. Daniel began making calls late into the night, pacing the hallway, his voice harsh and clipped. Through the thin walls, I caught words like loan shark deadline payment. His gambling debts were deep, deeper than I had realized, and I had just become his lifeline. He started showing up behind me when I counted receipts, when I checked balances, always too close, always pretending it was coincidence. I began to see my life in terms of risk assessment threat levels, escape plans. The training that had kept me alive overseas now mapped itself onto the floor plan of the farmhouse. Where were the exits? What objects could become weapons if needed? How quickly could I reach my car if it worked? Each day, my suspicion became certainty. My family was no longer family. They were predators circling prey. The worst moment came one evening when Daniel leaned over during dinner and whispered words that made my skin crawl. "You do not really think you will keep it all, do you? You are just a guest in this house. Guests leave." He smirked and stabbed his fork into the meat on his plate. Harold laughed as if it were a clever joke. Donna shook her head but said nothing. My pulse quickened, my appetite vanished. I stared at the food, but tasted nothing. That was when I realized the house itself had turned against me. It was no longer a home, but a stage being set. And I was the unwilling star of a play I had not agreed to perform. The night of the main attack began deceptively calm. Daniel suggested we should finally celebrate the lottery win properly. He said it with a smile that looked almost brotherly, as if the bitterness of the last few weeks had been washed away. He brought out a bottle of whiskey, a dusty one Harold had kept for years, and poured 2 glasses with exaggerated ceremony. He raised his glass in a mock toast and told me I had finally done something worthwhile, that I had finally given the family something to be proud of. His words were dipped in honey, but the sting underneath was impossible to miss. I hesitated, but my training had taught me to read situations to calculate the cost of confrontation. Refusing would have been seen as an insult, a declaration of war, and I was still hoping to de-escalate, still hoping maybe I was wrong about his intentions. I took a cautious sip. The liquid burned hotter than it should have. My throat tightened almost instantly. I knew then there was more than alcohol in that glass. I placed it down carefully and pretended to enjoy the taste while my mind sharpened with alarm. Daniel leaned back, watching me as if waiting for something. His grin widened when I swayed slightly on my feet. My vision blurred at the edges, my muscles heavier than they should have been. He stood quickly, his movements too precise to be anything but premeditated. In a single motion, he shoved me back into the chair and pressed a hand against my shoulder, pinning me as if I were nothing more than a rag doll. The sound of wood scraping across the floor echoed in the silence. He pulled a rope from behind the couch. I froze, the memory of his earlier searches flashing in my mind. He had planned this. Every warning sign I had ignored now converged into a chilling truth. My own brother was about to stage my death. My breath caught as he forced me up from the chair and marched me toward the beam that crossed the ceiling of the living room. The furniture had been moved, a chair already placed directly under the beam. My mother stood in the doorway clutching a dish towel, her face pale but her lips pressed tightly together. My father leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching with eyes that carried no hesitation, no doubt. They were complicit. Every ounce of hope I had held that my parents might stop him evaporated in that moment. Daniel shoved me onto the chair, his grip bruising against my arm. The rope looped around my wrists, first binding them roughly. Then he circled behind me and pulled it across my throat. The fibers bit into my skin. I gasped, struggling against the restraint, but his strength and the weight of betrayal pinned me harder than the rope itself. He hissed in my ear that this would be quick, that everyone would believe it, that I had never really belonged in this family anyway. He said once I was gone, the money would serve its true purpose. My legs trembled under me. The chair wobbled slightly. I could hear Harold chuckle from the corner, telling Daniel not to waste time. Donna whispered something about neighbors hearing noise. The rope tightened. Pressure surged against my throat, cutting air, cutting voice. Spots burst in my vision, the world shrinking into fragments of sound. My heartbeat thundered each pulse a desperate countdown. For a moment, panic clawed at me and I felt myself slipping. But muscle memory drilled into me through years of training cut through the fog. Breathe where you can. Conserve strength. Wait for an opening. Adapt and overcome. I shifted slightly, angling my chin to create a small pocket of air. It was not enough, but it bought me seconds. Seconds were everything. I forced my body to go slack, letting my weight hang so Daniel would think I had given up. He laughed a cruel short burst that made bile rise in my throat. He told our parents it was done. Harold muttered that it was for the best, that a soldier daughter had always been more trouble than worth. Donna's silence felt heavier than any blow. My chest screamed for oxygen. My arms burned against the rope. I tasted iron at the back of my mouth, vision flashing white. Yet inside, beneath the suffocating fear, anger lit like fire. Anger that they had waited until I built something of my own, only to steal it. Anger that they had spent years calling me weak, yet now relied on my supposed weakness to make their crime believable. Anger that the family I had once saluted goodbye to when I joined the army was now watching me suffocate without lifting a finger. My knees buckled, my body tilted. For a terrifying instant, the world went dark and silent as if I had already crossed a line I could not return from. Then a spark of instinct roared back. Not like this. Not tonight. My mind clung to training. Feign defeat until the enemy relaxes. His grip eased slightly as he stepped away to gloat. That slack was my chance. I shifted my wrists, testing the knot. Rough, but poorly tied, overconfident. My fingers searched for slack, my body swaying dangerously. Daniel was busy boasting to Harold, muttering about how quickly the bank could be accessed, about how $5 million would erase every debt. I pulled one hand free enough to loosen the rope at my neck. Air flooded in painful, but blessed. I kept my eyes half closed, kept my body limp, listening as they walked away. Donna whispered that it was over. Harold said the family would finally be respected again. Daniel said no one would ever question it. They left me hanging in that room, believing I was gone. They underestimated the will that had carried me through firefights, through nights when mortars lit the sky, through every moment I had thought I would not see dawn. My throat burned, my vision swam, but I was alive. Barely, but alive. The main attack had failed to finish me, and in that failure they had given me the most powerful weapon of all. Knowledge. I now knew exactly how far they were willing to go, and I knew I could not stay silent any longer. When Daniel left me hanging there believing his work was complete, I forced myself into stillness and used every ounce of strength to loosen the ropes. My training echoed in my head with the rhythm of survival. Panic kills. Patience saves. My fingers clawed at the knots until a loop slipped free. My chest heaved as a sliver of air filled my lungs. I bit down against the urge to cough. The sound would have given me away. Inch by inch, I freed one wrist, then the other. My arms dropped like leaden weights, but I caught myself before I collapsed entirely. I eased the rope from my neck, feeling the raw burn against my skin. For a moment, I stood swaying on the chair listening. Their voices drifted from the kitchen low and conspiratorial. I caught Daniel bragging that by morning he would have my bank information. Harold asked about selling the story to relatives to gain sympathy. Donna muttered something about arranging a quiet funeral. My stomach churned, but my mind steadied. If I confronted them now, I would be overpowered again. I needed proof. I needed distance. I needed time. I glanced down at the pocket of my fatigues where a small recording device rested. Old habits from the army. I always carried backups of everything from batteries to audio logs. I had slipped it into my pocket earlier when I sensed tension building. Now I prayed it had captured Daniel's words. I pressed the button to mark the file and tucked it deeper into my pocket. My throat burned from the pressure of the rope, every swallow like glass. My shoulders ached, my wrists swollen and red, but pain was a familiar companion. It reminded me I was still alive. I stepped off the chair silently and slipped toward the back door. Each creak of the wooden floor sounded like a gunshot in my ears. I froze twice when voices hushed in the kitchen. But luck and caution carried me to the door. Cold night air hit my face, and I almost wept with relief. I crouched low, moving across the yard toward the tree line. The moon lit patches of grass shadows stretching like claws. Behind me, the farmhouse loomed a place I had once called home, now transformed into enemy territory. My car sat in the driveway, but I knew better than to trust it. Daniel had tampered before. I needed another option. I reached the edge of the property and began walking toward the highway, each step fueled by fury more than strength. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. It would likely be them trying to track me. I kept moving until the faint headlights of a truck appeared in the distance. I raised my arm, waving frantically. The driver slowed a man in his 40s with suspicion etched across his face. I explained quickly, my voice raw, that I needed to get to town. He hesitated until I showed him my military ID. Something in his eyes shifted respect overtaking doubt. He nodded and let me climb in. The ride was short but felt endless. Every passing light made me fear Daniel's truck would appear behind us. But we reached town and I asked to be dropped at the edge near an apartment building I recognized. Sergeant Mark Davis lived there, an old comrade from my unit. I stumbled up the steps and knocked hard. When the door opened, I nearly collapsed. Mark caught me instantly, his voice sharp with alarm. "Laura, what happened?" I tried to answer, but my throat barely allowed words. He guided me inside, closed the door firmly, and pressed water into my hands. I drank slowly, each swallow painful but necessary. When I could finally speak, I told him everything. The rope, the staged death, the complicity of my parents. Mark's jaw tightened with every word, his fists clenching as if he could strike Daniel through the walls of that apartment. When I pulled the small recorder from my pocket and played the muffled voices, his eyes hardened. "We have evidence," he said firmly. "But you cannot go back alone." He set up his spare bedroom for me and made me promise not to leave until we had a plan. That night, as I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, I felt both safer and more broken than I ever had. My body trembled with aftershocks of fear. Images of the rope, the beam, Daniel's grin replayed endlessly. Yet beneath the terror, a new resolve took root. They had tried to erase me. They had failed. Now I would show them what survival looked like. The next morning, Mark helped me document injuries. Bruises across my neck, rope burns on my wrists, all photographed with timestamps. He reminded me that in court documentation wins battles as surely as weapons do in war. We transferred the audio file to multiple devices, ensuring it could not be erased. Every step I took was careful, methodical, as if preparing for another mission. I checked my bank accounts and saw attempted logins from unknown devices. They were already trying to strip me of everything. I called the bank and froze accounts, setting new passwords and requesting alerts. The representative sounded skeptical at first, until I explained that my family had attempted to stage my death. My voice cracked, but I held steady. She promised to flag the accounts for fraud monitoring. When I hung up, I felt a small surge of victory. One front of the battle secured. Mark insisted we contact someone with legal authority who understood the military context. That was when I remembered Sarah Thompson, a JAG lawyer I had met during my service. I dialed her number with shaking hands. She answered with calm efficiency. When I told her what happened, there was a long silence. Then she said, "Bring me everything. Audio, photos, any documentation. I will help." Hearing those words felt like reinforcements arriving on a battlefield just as the line begins to collapse. Still, the fear lingered. That evening, a call came from my mother. I stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. Minutes later, a voicemail arrived. Donna's voice was strained but soft, pleading that I come home, that Daniel had been upset. But things were fine now. She said families fight, that I was overreacting, that I needed rest. I deleted it, but her words echoed anyway. They were rewriting the story, already painting me as unstable. The manipulation was sharp as ever. Mark warned me to expect more. He was right. The next morning, news spread through relatives that I was struggling mentally, that I had threatened myself. Daniel was playing the role of the grieving brother preparing to handle my affairs. It might have worked if not for the evidence in my pocket and the bruises on my skin. Anger surged again, but I forced myself to breathe. They wanted me rattled. I would not give them that. Instead, I sat with Mark spread documents across the table and mapped a plan. Each bill I had paid, each receipt, each bank statement. I organized them into folders labeled by month. If they tried to argue I was a burden, I would show the world how I had carried them. If they claimed I was unstable, I would show the calculated attempts to take my identity. Every detail mattered. The soldier in me thrived on preparation. That night I lay awake, replaying the moment the rope tightened. My body shook, but I whispered to myself over and over, "You are alive. You are stronger. You will not let them win them." It was not just survival anymore. It was resistance. Intelligent, relentless, undeniable. I would not only protect what was mine, I would make sure the truth was seen by everyone who had ever believed their lies. The days that followed became a mission of rebuilding and preparation. I treated every morning as if I were back in uniform, waking early, writing down objectives, checking them off one by one. It was the only way to keep my mind steady after the chaos of that night. Mark set up his dining table as a command center. We spread out folders of documents, photographs of bruises, copies of receipts. The small recorder with Daniel's voice captured forever in digital clarity. Each piece of paper was a weapon sharper than any blade. I felt strength returning with every step of organization. Yet beneath the discipline, fear still lurked. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched, half expecting Daniel's rage or Harold's threats. Instead came messages from cousins repeating the narrative my parents were feeding them. They said I had broken down, that the army had ruined me, that I was unstable and dangerous to myself. Reading those words felt like being erased in real time. I wanted to scream, but instead I breathed slowly, remembered my training, and focused on facts. Sarah Thompson called on the third morning. Her voice was calm and steady, the kind of voice that cut through chaos. She asked for every file we had. I scanned the documents, emailed the audio, sent photographs with timestamps. She promised she would begin building a case immediately. Hearing her promise gave me a rare moment of relief. I was not fighting alone anymore. Mark stayed vigilant, checking locks twice a night, keeping his phone by his bed in case we needed to call for help. His presence reminded me what true loyalty looked like. Still, the shadows of betrayal clung to me. One evening, my phone rang with Donna's name on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. Her voice was soft, almost tender, calling me sweetheart, like she had when I was a child. For a moment, my heart ached with longing, but then her words cut. She said I was imagining things, that Daniel had been joking, that I was twisting stories in my head. She said if I told anyone what I thought had happened, people would believe I was sick. She pleaded that I come home quietly, that the family could handle things better without outsiders. The gaslighting was surgical, cutting deep, targeting the part of me that still wanted to be a daughter. My throat tightened, not from the rope this time, but from the weight of manipulation. I ended the call without replying, my hands shaking. Mark saw my face and knew. He said gently but firmly that I could not let their voices back inside. He was right. That night, I deleted every voicemail without listening. Still, Donna's tone haunted me, a weapon wrapped in motherly affection. The next day, Sarah asked me to meet her in her office. I wore a scarf to hide the marks on my throat. She greeted me with a firm handshake, her eyes sharp but kind. She listened as I described everything again in detail, writing notes methodically. When I finished, she leaned back and said we had more than enough to begin legal proceedings. She said attempted murder combined with fraud was undeniable. My heart pounded hearing those words. Yet fear surfaced again. I asked if families ever managed to twist such cases. She admitted they tried, but said evidence like ours spoke louder than manipulation. Her confidence steadied me. Walking out of her office, I felt taller despite the bruises still healing. That night, I began writing a timeline. From the day I won the lottery to the night of the rope, each event laid out clearly. It was not just for the case. It was for me a way to reclaim the narrative they had tried to steal. Every line of ink was a proof I still existed, still fought, still owned my life. But emotional waves kept crashing. 1 hour I felt powerful, envisioning Daniel behind bars. The next I felt small, curled on the couch as whispers from my childhood replayed. Worthless, weak, burden. I had to remind myself those words were lies. I whispered new ones out loud to overwrite them. Survivor, soldier, fighter. The contrast between despair and determination became my rhythm. On the fourth evening, I received a text from an unknown number. It read simply, "You should stop before you make things worse." My stomach dropped. I showed it to Mark, and he cursed under his breath. We saved the message and reported it to Sarah. She advised me to ignore but document everything. I realized then that my family was not going to back down quietly. They were escalating again. My fear shifted to anger. If they wanted a war of stories, I would give them facts louder than any rumor. We purchased a small safe and placed the original recorder inside, along with duplicates on flash drives. Mark taught me how to set up a simple camera near his doorway to monitor the hall. For the first time since that night, I slept without jolting awake at every creak. Still, dreams came filled with rope and Daniel's grin. I woke, drenched in sweat, but each morning I forced myself back to the table, back to the plan. I remembered missions overseas when survival meant preparation. This was no different. The enemy wore familiar faces, but the tactics remained the same. Document, secure, plan, strike. On the 7th day, Sarah called with news that made my chest tighten. She said she had spoken with local law enforcement, and they were ready to intervene. All we needed was the right moment to expose everything publicly. She suggested gathering a place where Daniel and my parents would feel confident enough to speak freely, where evidence could be revealed in front of witnesses. The idea terrified me, but also thrilled me. A confrontation not hidden in the shadows, but dragged into the light. Mark nodded when I told him. He said justice needed eyes to see it. That evening, I sat alone at the window watching city lights flicker. I thought about the girl who had left the farmhouse at 18, desperate for freedom. I thought about the soldier who had crawled through sandstorms. I thought about the woman hanging from the ceiling beam. Each version of me had survived. Now it was time to show the world that survival was not enough. It was time for justice. The invitation to the so-called family meeting arrived through a cousin. At first, I wanted to ignore it to stay hidden and let Sarah handle everything through legal channels, but when I read the message closely, I saw the truth. It was not a meeting to heal wounds. It was a stage for Daniel and my parents to paint me as unstable to spread their narrative while I remained silent. They planned to bury me socially since they had failed to bury me physically. My heart pounded with anger as I realized silence would mean surrender. Sarah agreed. She said if they were gathering witnesses, it could become the perfect place to shatter their story with evidence. Mark offered to stand by my side, though the invitation was not meant for him. I thanked him, but said this battle had to be mine. On the night of the meeting, I wore a simple black blouse, nothing flashy, but I wrapped a scarf around my throat to cover the healing bruises. The marks still ached, but they also reminded me why I was going. When I arrived at Aunt Phyllis's house, the driveway was crowded with cars. Lights glowed through the windows, voices drifted out the hum of gossip already building. I paused at the door, nerves rattling my bones, then forced myself to step inside. The room went quiet for a moment as everyone saw me. I could feel their eyes scanning my face, searching for signs of the broken woman Daniel had described. Daniel himself stood near the fireplace wearing a black jacket that looked borrowed, his expression solemn yet smug. Harold sat heavily in an armchair, his beer resting on the armrest as if this were any ordinary gathering. Donna clutched a tissue, her eyes wet as if she had been crying. The performance was in full swing. A cousin whispered that it was brave of them to gather despite my behavior. Another nodded sympathetically toward Daniel. I clenched my fists but kept my face calm. Daniel began speaking in a voice dripping with sorrow. He told everyone that I had been struggling since returning from service, that the lottery win had overwhelmed me, that I had accused him unfairly of horrible things. He dabbed at his eyes theatrically. He said he feared for my safety, that he and our parents had tried everything to help, but I pushed them away. Harold interrupted to say I had always been difficult, that the army had filled my head with paranoia, that I was making up wild stories. Donna whispered through her tears that she prayed every night for me to heal. Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the relatives. My stomach twisted. For a moment, I felt that old childhood helplessness, the same silence that had trapped me at the dinner table when lies were believed and my voice was drowned out. But then I remembered the recorder in my purse, the photos, the documents. I had more than words now. I had proof. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the murmurs. Enough. The room stilled. Do you want to know what really happened? Eyes turned to me, some wary, some curious. Daniel smirked, clearly confident his story had already rooted deep. He told me to sit down to stop embarrassing myself. I looked at him steadily and reached into my purse. The small recorder felt heavy in my hand, not from weight, but from meaning. I pressed play. At first, only static filled the air. Then Daniel's voice, unmistakable, cruel, and sharp. Hang her, make it look like she did it herself, then we get the $5 million. Gasps spread across the room. Donna's hand flew to her mouth. Harold shifted in his chair, face paling. Daniel's smirk cracked for the first time. I let the recording play longer, capturing Harold's muttered approval. Donna's whispered concern about neighbors hearing. The silence that followed was electric. Relatives stared at me, then at them, disbelief etched into their faces. Aunt Phyllis spoke first, her voice trembling. Is this true? Did you really try to? She could not finish the sentence. I lifted my scarf slightly, revealing the angry red marks around my throat. Several people gasped. The bruises spoke louder than any words. I pulled out folders from my bag, spreading them on the table. Bank statements showing payments I had made for the household, utility bills in my name, receipts for groceries, for repairs, for medical costs. Each page proof that far from being a burden I had carried them. Daniel shouted that the evidence was fake, that I was staging things to make him look bad. His voice cracked with desperation. Harold bellowed that I was ungrateful, that family matters should stay private. Donna wept, but offered no denial. The relatives shifted uneasily, eyes darting between us. I steadied my breath. For years they had controlled the story. Tonight the story was mine. I told them everything, how Daniel had drugged me, how he had tied the rope, how my parents had watched. My voice shook at first, but grew stronger as I spoke. I saw shock and horror ripple across the faces of those listening. No one moved to stop me. Even those who had once sided with my parents now leaned forward, listening, as if hearing the truth for the first time. Daniel tried to interrupt, but I played the recording again, his own voice damning him. This time, no one believed his denial. The tide had turned. The emotional weight in the room shifted suddenly. For a moment, I felt vulnerable, stripped bare in front of them, but then triumph surged. I was no longer the silent daughter, no longer the scapegoat. I was the soldier standing before a jury of family with evidence as my armor. Sarah had been right. A confrontation in the open was exactly what we needed. The murmurs turned against them. Cousins who had looked at me with suspicion now glared at Daniel. Aunts whispered angrily about Harold's complicity. Someone muttered that the police should be called immediately. Daniel's face twisted rage, replacing pretense. He shouted that I was destroying the family, that I had always been jealous of him. His voice rose until he was nearly screaming, but the more he ranted, the guiltier he appeared. Harold slammed his beer on the table and barked that everyone should shut up, but the authority he once wielded was gone. The relatives ignored him. Donna sobbed quietly, repeating that it had all been a mistake. The room had turned, and they could feel it. I gathered my documents calmly, tucking them back into my bag. I looked at every face in the room and said clearly, I am not the weak one. I am not the liar. I am the survivor. If you cannot accept that, then you will watch as the law does. The silence that followed felt like a battlefield after the smoke clears, stunned and heavy. Then, someone pulled out a phone and dialed. Daniel lunged toward me, but several cousins grabbed his arms, holding him back. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes, not mine. As the sirens approached outside, I felt a surge of vindication so sharp it made my knees weak. The confrontation had ended. The war was not over, but the tide had finally turned in my favor. The police arrived that night faster than I expected, their flashing lights painting Aunt Phyllis's house in red and blue. Daniel shouted that it was a mistake, that it was family business, that I was out of control. His words tumbled over themselves in panic. Harold barked at the officers that they had no right to interfere in private affairs. Donna wept quietly in the corner, clutching her tissue as if it could shield her from the truth. But the officers did not waver. They listened to the recording, they saw the bruises on my throat, and within minutes, Daniel was in handcuffs, his protests echoing into the night as he was led to the patrol car. Harold tried to follow, but an officer blocked him. Donna clung to Harold's arm, trembling. I stood in the center of the room, steadying my breath, watching as the people who had once ruled over me now looked small and powerless. In that moment, I felt the weight of years lift slightly, though I knew the battle was not finished. The days that followed blurred with interviews and statements. Sarah guided me through each step. I sat with detectives, showing them documents, handing over copies of the audio recording, pointing out every instance of fraud, every attempt to access my accounts. They nodded grimly, writing down details, their faces hardening as the picture formed. They told me attempted murder combined with financial fraud carried serious consequences. They also began investigating Harold and Donna for aiding and abetting. I expected relief, but instead a strange heaviness settled in my chest. These were my parents, and yet they had chosen to watch silently as Daniel tried to erase me. Part of me still struggled to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. When the case went to court months later, I walked into the courthouse with Sarah at my side. The building felt cavernous, its walls humming with the echoes of countless lives judged within. My palms were damp, my heart steady but heavy. Rows of seats filled with spectators, reporters, and relatives who had come to see the spectacle. At the defense table, Daniel sat in a suit that looked borrowed, his hair neatly combed, his expression carefully arranged into one of wounded innocence. Harold sat beside him, his face carved in stone, while Donna dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Their attorney spoke quietly to them, but their eyes kept darting toward me. When the judge entered the room, silence fell. The proceedings began slowly, methodically. Sarah presented the evidence with calm precision. She played the audio recording for the court. Daniel's voice filled the chamber again, sharp and undeniable. "Hang her! Make it look like she did it herself, then we get the $5 million. Gasps rippled through the spectators. I saw Daniel flinch, his mask cracking for a brief second. Sarah displayed photographs of my injuries, time-stamped and authenticated. She showed receipts proving I had carried the household financially for months. She presented bank records showing attempts to access my accounts from the Mitchell residence. Piece by piece, the story was laid bare. The defense tried to argue that I had fabricated the evidence, that my military service had left me unstable, that I was staging an elaborate revenge against my family. They pointed at my scars, at my trembling hands, at the nightmares I admitted to having. They painted me as broken, but Sarah countered with calm authority. She reminded the court that being a survivor did not mean being unstable. She reminded them that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of truth despite fear. She called Mark to the stand. He testified to the night I arrived at his apartment, bruised, terrified, carrying evidence that had not yet been shared. His voice was steady, his eyes locked on the jury, his loyalty shining through every word. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand, my legs heavy but my spine straight. I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. As I spoke, I felt the weight of every eye on me. I described the night Daniel entered my room with whiskey, the taste of the liquid burning my throat the moment the rope tightened around my neck. I described hearing my father's approval, my mother's whispered concern about neighbors, their silence when I struggled for breath. My voice shook, but I forced each word out, refusing to let them silence me again. The courtroom was silent except for my testimony. Some jurors' eyes glistened with tears. Others looked grim, their jaws tight. When I finished, I felt hollow, as if I had poured out every secret I had carried. The defense tried to rattle me with questions, asking if I had misinterpreted, if I had exaggerated, if my trauma had colored my memory. I met their eyes and said firmly, "No. I know what I lived through. I know what I heard. I know what was done to me." The clarity in my voice seemed to shake them. When closing arguments arrived, Sarah spoke with a quiet conviction that resonated deeper than shouting ever could. She told the jury that families are meant to protect, not to exploit. She said betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from blood, but justice must still prevail. She asked them to look at the evidence, not the excuses. Then the jury left to deliberate. Hours felt like years. I sat in the courtroom with Mark beside me, his presence a steady anchor. I stared at the table where my parents whispered to each other, where Daniel scowled, where their attorney shuffled papers nervously. Finally, the jury returned. My pulse hammered in my ears as the foreperson stood. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. Daniel's face twisted rage spilling out as he shouted that it was all lies. The judge banged the gavel and ordered him silent. Then the sentencing came. 25 years in prison for Daniel. 10 years of probation and supervision for Harold. Mandatory rehabilitation for Donna. The words echoed like thunder through the chamber. My body sagged with relief so intense I nearly collapsed. Tears blurred my vision, but I did not hide them. For once, they were not tears of fear, but of release. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Relatives whispered in shock. Some looked at me with newfound respect. Others with shame for ever doubting. I walked out of that courthouse into the sunlight, the air crisp and clean against my face. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. Justice had been served. The war was not entirely over, scars remained, but the battlefield had shifted. I was no longer the target. I was the survivor standing tall. The verdict rippled through the community like a stone dropped into still water. Within hours of the sentencing, local newspapers carried headlines that seemed almost surreal to read. Soldier's family tried to fake her death for lottery millions. My name appeared in bold letters alongside words like survival and justice. Neighbors who once looked away when Harold barked at me in the yard now whispered openly about the scandal. Reporters parked outside the courthouse for days, snapping photos of me walking with Sarah and Mark, while Harold and Donna tried to shield their faces from cameras. The story spread beyond the town, reaching state news, then national outlets. Each retelling exposed the rot that had festered in our family for years. The Mitchell name, once spoken with Harold's pride, became synonymous with betrayal. I should have felt shame, but instead I felt vindication. For too long, I had been the silent one. Now the truth stood where everyone could see it. In prison, Daniel's troubles deepened. Word circulated that his gambling debts had followed him inside. Old enemies recognized him as an easy mark. Letters from the prison chaplain described fights, bruises a man unraveling behind bars. I did not rejoice at his suffering, but I could not deny the grim satisfaction of watching consequence find him. He had tried to erase me. Instead, he was the one erased from freedom. Harold endured his probation bitterly. He returned to the farmhouse, but it was not the same fortress of authority. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid him. Former friends no longer invited him to gatherings. He shouted at reporters once demanding respect, but the footage went viral as a symbol of denial. Donna entered rehabilitation quietly, attending sessions where she was forced to confront her complicity. I heard she wept often, repeating that she never lifted a hand, but forgetting that silence can be just as sharp as any weapon. For me, the months after the trial became a strange mixture of peace and purpose. The lottery winnings sat untouched for weeks as I decided what to do. Money had nearly destroyed me. I needed to use it differently. With Sarah's guidance, I set aside $1 million to establish a foundation for veterans and women escaping abusive homes. I named it the Mitchell Resilience Fund, reclaiming the family name from disgrace and turning it into something healing. The first time I signed the papers, I felt a swell of pride deeper than anything the lottery itself had given me. Reporters covered the story of the fund, and for once, my name was not tied to betrayal, but to rebuilding. Messages poured in from strangers thanking me, from veterans who said they finally felt seen, from women who said my story gave them courage to walk away from toxic families. Reading those messages became my anchor. Still, consequences for my parents and brother echoed in my daily life. Grocery store trips meant overhearing whispers. Children in town pointed at the farmhouse, calling it haunted by scandal. Once I saw Donna walking alone, her shoulders slumped, her tissue crumpled in her hand. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw a flicker of something, maybe regret, maybe just exhaustion. I turned away. Forgiveness was not mine to give yet. At night, I sometimes dreamed of the rope again, the feeling of weightlessness, the sound of Daniel's laugh. I would wake gasping, but then I would see the documents of the foundation on my desk and remember that the past no longer held me prisoner. Public revenge did not come from shouting at them. It came from living, from thriving, from showing the world they had failed to break me. When the first foundation check went to fund housing for homeless veterans, I stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony surrounded by cameras. Mark stood beside me, clapping me on the back, telling me I had done something good out of something horrific. In the crowd, I spotted familiar faces from town people who once doubted me, now nodding in respect. Karma had done its work not through my hands alone, but through truth revealed and justice served. Daniel's letters arrived occasionally from prison. They were rambling, alternating between apologies and demands. He claimed he had been desperate, that he had been led astray by debt, that he still deserved part of the money because we shared blood. I never replied. Instead, I kept each letter as another record of his downfall, a reminder that some bonds are not worth salvaging. Harold never wrote. Donna sent one letter begging me to visit, saying she was lonely, that Harold had grown cruel even toward her. I read it once and placed it in a drawer. Healing did not mean reopening wounds. Public perception cemented the story in ways that surprised me. Documentaries were proposed. Articles analyzed the case as an example of greed and betrayal. My name was linked with resilience, with standing up against even the closest of enemies. For once, the narrative was mine. Sometimes when I walked past the courthouse, I felt the ghosts of testimony still echoing in the walls. But then I remembered the sound of the gavel, the finality of guilty, and I breathed easier. Consequences had been delivered not only in prison sentences, but in the stripping away of masks. My parents could no longer pretend to be pillars of the community. Daniel could no longer pretend to be the favored son. Their reputations, once polished by lies, now lay shattered. And in the shards, I found my own reflection, stronger, sharper, unbroken. Revenge was not about hurting them back. It was about showing the world I had survived them. It was about taking the money they wanted to steal and turning it into light for others. It was about walking into public places with my head high while they hid in shadows. That was justice enough for me. 1 year later, the world around me felt unrecognizable compared to the night I dangled from the beam of my parents' house. The bruises on my throat had faded to faint lines, but the memory remained etched deeper than skin. I no longer lived in fear of footsteps outside my door or whispers through thin walls. Instead, I lived in a small apartment filled with sunlight and silence, the kind of silence that comforted rather than suffocated. My mornings began with the smell of fresh coffee instead of the stench of stale beer. Bills lay neatly organized on my desk, each one paid on time, each one bearing only my name. That alone felt like victory. Thanksgiving arrived again, and this time I set the table myself, not out of obligation, but out of choice. The apartment was smaller than the farmhouse dining room, yet every inch of it radiated warmth. I roasted a modest turkey-baked pies with recipes I had collected from friends and spread mismatched dishes across the table. To me, it looked perfect because it was mine. Mark arrived first, carrying a bottle of cider and a grin that reminded me of nights overseas when laughter broke through the hardest days. Sarah followed, bringing a stack of scholarship applications she thought I might help review for the foundation. The air buzzed with conversation and laughter as we settled in. For the first time in years, I felt surrounded not by blood, but by family. Later in the evening, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, my younger sister Tessa stood there, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes nervous yet determined. She was 17 now, taller, her voice steadier. She said quietly that she could not stay with Harold and Donna any longer, that she wanted to leave before she became like them. My chest ached as I pulled her into the apartment. She looked around at the table, at Mark and Sarah, at the warm glow of the room. Tears filled her eyes. I told her she could stay as long as she needed, that this was a place of safety. That night, as we sat together over pie, I realized the cycle could break, that even in the rubble of betrayal, something new could grow. The months that followed were filled with purpose. Tessa enrolled in college with my help filling out forms late at night while I explained terms and deadlines. The foundation expanded funding housing projects and job training for veterans. Each success reminded me that survival had blossomed into something larger than myself. Yet reflection often pulled me back. I sometimes walked past the old farmhouse now abandoned and silent weeds overtaking the porch windows shuttered. Neighbors avoided it like a cursed place. I stood at the edge of the property once breathing in the cold air and realized it no longer held power over me. It was just wood and brick stripped of the lies that once held me captive. Forgiveness was a word that hovered often. Did I forgive Harold for his fists, Donna for her silence, Daniel for his rope? The answer shifted with time. Some days I felt pity for their downfall. Other days I felt fury rise again. But what I learned was that forgiveness was not about excusing them. It was about freeing myself. I no longer carried their weight. I let it fall where it belonged on their shoulders, in their sentences, in their ruined reputations. At night, when I lay in my own bed, the hum of the city outside, I whispered to myself words that once felt impossible. You are safe. You are free. You are enough. On the anniversary of the trial, I hosted another dinner. This time, the table included veterans who had benefited from the foundation women who had escaped homes as suffocating as mine once was, and friends who had become brothers and sisters in every way that mattered. We raised our glasses, and Mark proposed a toast to found family and to boundaries worth keeping. I looked around at the faces glowing in candlelight and felt tears slip down my cheeks. This was the life I had fought for, the life I had nearly lost. When the evening ended and guests drifted home, I stepped onto the balcony. The city lights stretched endlessly, each one a reminder of lives unfolding. Choices made, stories written. I thought about the Laura who had hung from that rope, gasping eyes darkening, convinced the end had come. I thought about the Laura who had stood in court trembling yet unbroken. And I thought about the Laura who now stood free, scars turned into strength. I turned toward the camera on my desk, the one I used for interviews about the foundation, and pressed record. My voice came steady, carrying across the quiet room. Family is supposed to protect you. But sometimes, family betrays you in ways strangers never could. When that happens, you face a choice. Do you let their lies define you, or do you stand and define yourself? I paused, staring into the lens, knowing the video would reach people like me, people trapped in homes of silence and cruelty. I continued. I was called weak. I was nearly erased. But I am still here, and if you are listening, you can still be here too. You do not have to let betrayal be the last word. The camera light blinked red as I ended the recording. I sat back, breathing slowly, and for the first time in years, I felt complete. The scars remained, but they no longer bound me. They marked the path I had walked from victim to survivor to advocate. As dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold, I whispered one last reflection. Family is not where you are born. It is where you are believed, where you are safe, where you are loved. And if betrayal has stolen that from you, you have the power to build it anew. I lifted my coffee mug in a silent toast to the rising sun. I was alive. I was free, and I was ready for whatever came next. When I look back now, it almost feels like a story I heard about someone else, a tale whispered in the dark about a soldier who returned home only to find the battlefield waiting inside her own walls. But every scar on my body, every page of documentation, every restless night reminds me that it was real. I lived it, I survived it, and I rebuilt from it. That is the truth I carry, the truth I choose to share, not because I want pity, but because I want people to know that survival is possible, even when the attack comes from those who should love you most. In the months after the trial, I walked through life with a strange mix of freedom and fragility. Freedom because the rope no longer threatened my neck, because the law had spoken, because my brother sat behind bars. Fragility because the echoes remained, the memories creeping in during quiet moments. Sometimes I caught myself jumping at the sound of footsteps in the hallway of my apartment building. Sometimes I woke gasping from dreams where the rope tightened again. Healing is not a straight path. It is a road that bends and twists, sometimes leading you forward, sometimes dragging you back. But each day I chose to keep walking. The foundation I created became both my shield and my sword. Every donation, every project, every message from a veteran who found housing or a woman who found safety reminded me that pain can be transformed into power. It did not erase what had happened, but it reshaped it. Instead of being only the victim of betrayal, I became part of something larger than myself. I watched other survivors take their first steps out of darkness, and I saw reflections of my own journey. In their eyes, I saw fear, but also courage. And I knew that if my story could give them even a spark of strength, then speaking it aloud was worth every tremble in my voice. There were quiet victories, too. The first time I painted a wall in my apartment deep teal just because I liked the color. The first time I bought groceries without calculating if my family's bills would drain me. The first time I laughed so hard with Mark and Sarah that my sides ached, realizing laughter no longer felt foreign. These were not headlines or court verdicts, but they mattered. They were signs that I was alive and more than body alive in spirit. Not every day was light. Sometimes letters arrived from Daniel written in jagged handwriting, alternating between apologies and accusations. Sometimes Donna tried to call, her voice trembling with pleas that I forgive, that I come home. Sometimes I felt the weight of those memories pressing down, whispering that maybe I was too harsh, maybe family deserved another chance. But then I remembered the rope, the bruises, the way they watched and did nothing. I reminded myself that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and reconciliation is not required for healing. I could let go without letting them back in. That realization became a turning point. I was no longer chained by their expectations. A year later, when Thanksgiving came, the table in my apartment filled with faces that reflected choice rather than blood. Veterans' friends, Sarah, Mark, and finally Tessa, my younger sister sitting at the table, felt like the most profound victory of all. She had found the courage to step out from under Harold and Donna's shadow and begin her own path. Watching her laugh over pie, hearing her talk about college classes, I felt tears burn in my eyes. I thought of the night she brushed my wrist at the sink, the tiny gesture of solidarity when the world felt like it was collapsing. Now she sat free, her future still hers. That night I whispered to myself that the cycle had been broken. The farmhouse stands empty now, a shell of a place that once tried to bury me. Weeds climb the porch windows, crack the air around it heavy with silence. Neighbors cross the street to avoid it, calling it haunted. In a way it is. Haunted not by ghosts, but by the truth of what happened there. I drove past it once, parked at the edge of the property, and stared at the windows that once framed my childhood. I expected anger, but what I felt was distance. It was no longer my prison. It was just wood and dust. I turned the key in my car and drove away without looking back. The real home I built is not a building. It is the circle of people who stand with me now. Mark, who never asked for details I could not give but always offered safety. Sarah, who fought with precision and never doubted my voice. Tessa, who chose freedom. And the countless strangers who reached out after hearing my story, turning my isolation into connection. That is family. That is home. I often think about what message I would give to someone standing where I once stood, someone caught between loyalty to blood and the desperate need to save themselves. I would tell them this silence will not protect you. Gaslighting will not define you. And betrayal, as sharp as it feels, is not the final word. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to rebuild. You are allowed to find family not by blood, but by choice. The night Daniel tried to hang me, I thought the story would end with my last breath. Instead, it became the beginning of something else. A soldier's survival is not only measured in battles fought overseas. Sometimes the fiercest battles are fought in living rooms, in courtrooms, in the quiet of your own mind. And victory is not only surviving, but thriving afterward. I know many who hear my story will wonder if I regret ever buying that lottery ticket. After all, $5 million nearly cost me my life. But the truth is, I do not regret it. Because that ticket did not create the greed, the violence, or the betrayal. It only revealed what was already there. And in revealing it, it gave me the chance to confront it, to survive it, and to end it. in a way that Ticket bought me not just freedom, but clarity. So now I ask you, whoever you are, wherever you are listening to this story, what would you do when those who should love you most turn into your greatest danger? Would you stay silent to keep the peace, or would you risk everything to protect your truth? I know what I chose. I chose to survive. I chose to speak. I chose to build a new life. And I hope if you ever face betrayal, you will choose the same. Because the rope that almost ended me did not define me. What defined me was the moment I pulled air back into my lungs, the moment I stood in that courtroom, the moment I signed the papers to help others like me. What defines me now is not what was done to me, but what I do with the life they failed to take. And that is the reflection I leave with you. Family is not where you are born. It is where you are safe. It is where you are believed. It is where you are free. If you cannot find it in the place you came from, you are allowed to create it elsewhere. I did. And if I can, so can you.